The following podcast is scheduled for one fall. Ladies and gentlemen, weighing in at amazingly entertaining, I want to welcome to the ring the greatest, most technically sound podcast on the face of the planet. Ladies and gentlemen, it is time for Wrestling with Wi-Fi. Tuning in right now.
And with that, we are back. Another episode. I'm trying to be more consistent about it. I will say that for a couple different reasons, I'm noticing a nice uptick in the listening count. I mean, I'm not going to set any records, and I'm certainly not going to put Joe Rogan on notice yet. But, hey, I think we've gone up about 3 times the listeners in just a couple weeks, which is nice. I think some of that, I guess, I can credit WLPC for, and some of my folks who know this is out doing their part to retweet or share the Wrestling with Wi-Fi Twitter. So anyways, back today, tonight, whatever you want to call it. It is tonight. I'm sitting here recording at 7:30 in the dark. Thursday, gosh, I guess it's October 26th, but I'm not paying attention to a calendar. And yeah, we're gonna chat about today a little bit. I think it's an interesting topic to me, but sort of, I have an education degree, which I never used and never actually taught in a formal classroom setting. But we're going to go with, those who can do and those who can't teach. And it popped into my head the other day because, as I mentioned in a prior episode, I am up to pitch or present, if you will, the RCWA boot camp at this year's, or next year's rather, the 2023 edition of Phoenix's WLPC in February. And it's a big deal for Ruckus because we haven't, I don't think, been up there in a while. And it's a big deal, I think, for me. Well, I know it's a big deal for me because I haven't ever taught a boot camp before. I've done some informal teaching at my prior employer when it came to things like ECHO, just sort of knowledge transfer and things like that. And I've certainly talked to and quote unquote taught or imparted my knowledge to people along the way throughout my 20 some odd years in IT. But this is a completely different, environment for me because it's a boot camp. People are actually selecting the Ruckus boot camp. And they want to come to Phoenix, and they're going to give up a weekend, and they're going to learn RCWA. And I mean, it's a really cool thing. It's an incredible honor that my employer is allowing me to do this. I treat it as an incredible honor, and I'm excited. I'm nervous. I'm all sorts of different emotions, which is cool and good and all that. And I'm going to be ready for it. Don't get me wrong. But where it got me going to is, I remember a line that I heard way back when I was in college, and I've heard it many times since, that, those who can do and those who can't teach. And I think it's an unfair saying, but we'll talk about it anyway. So I thought about that. I'm like, well, does that mean I can't do Wi-Fi, so I'm going to teach it? I don't necessarily agree with that, although I will say this about that. I know I have my CWNE. I also know that there are plenty of people out there that do Wi-Fi who I would say are probably smarter, better, more experienced than I am at Wi-Fi, whether it's troubleshooting, deploying, designing. They've got more experience, what have you. And for whatever reason, they've just never bothered to get a certificate. They've never bothered to get the CWNE. They've never bothered to get any of the formal documentation that says, hey, I'm a certified wireless network expert. And it's sort of a debate, and I don't know that it's such a hot debate within Wi-Fi, but it's just in general with tech spaces. This, I apologize, as if you haven't figured it out, we're going to go all over the place tonight, just like any other episode. Certificates are a bit of a hot topic, right? Degrees are another one. I've had this conversation with people in my circle of friends and in my life. I, as somebody who has a college degree, and I've never used it formally, I've never taught. My degree is in elementary education. I've never been a teacher outside of student teaching when I was in college. So for me, it's hard for me to tell somebody, you need to have this degree. You need this because, well, why? How can I tell somebody they need it? I don't use what I have. I paid, $1,000 in college debt. Don't use it. So hard pressed to say that. And I know, as somebody who's been in IT in my entire life, and I've been close to, training. I mean, I've seen, what getting a certificate can do, and I know people like Chris Avance from Wi-Fi Training and things like that, where you can spend a fraction of the cost on an IT certification. You can go, if you want to be an InfoSec, you can go get, certified ethical hacker or pen testing certifications. And I apologize, I don't know them all. I know there's like Security Plus, and I think CISSP is one, but I think that's a really hard one to get. I'm not 100% sure. Don't slam me for it. I don't know. It's not my area of expertise. But I'm giving you an example. Like you can go out and get a Microsoft cert or an Amazon Azure cert or, Google Cloud certified. And obviously cloud is a big thing. And without incurring a whole lot of debt in the grand scheme of things, a couple $1,000s, maybe 10, I don't know, whatever a boot camp or, an intensive couple months of a certification course costs, you get that experience. And because you've got that piece of paper that says you've gone through the courses, that you passed the exams, there are going to be people that are going to be more inclined to hire you and give you the entry-level experience you need, as opposed to just starting on the ground level and learning and getting your foot in the door. Both ways are valid. Both ways are viable. But the certificate, at the end of the day, I think in a lot of cases, not every case, but in a lot of cases, that piece of paper helps open the door. And sometimes that's all it does. I'll be completely honest. I got my master's degree, and it opened a couple doors. It was a conversation starter on some interviews, and that was about it. I can sit here now and say, I can't definitively say that one job, because I produced my master's degree paperwork, I got a huge bump, or I got the job because I had it and somebody else didn't. So I'm just wrapping here. At the end of the day, I'm not disputing, I'm not discounting any of the values of any of those educational experiences. They've all shaped who I am. They've all put me where I am. So, take that with a grain of salt. And so circling back to the Wi-Fi side, right? Same deal, right? If you know you love Wi-Fi, and I don't know if any 18, 19, 20-year-old person is going to sit there today, right now, and say, I know I love Wi-Fi. But you could sit there and say, I'm going to go and I'm going to come to WLPC, or I'm going to go to Wi-Fi Check or wireless technology, whatever they have, if they ever have it again. Or you're going to go find some training courses that are offered online and get your CWNA and your AP and your SP and your DP and chase your CWNE. Of course, you can't get that without experience, but you could theoretically chase those without ever having a college degree and make a damn good living. However, I know some people, I'm sure we all do in the wireless space, that don't have that degree or don't have that piece of paper that says I'm a CWNE or any of the underlying certificates, really, or maybe they have one, maybe they got CWNE, or I'm sorry, ECSE because they were dragged to it because somebody that worked for the same company as them had extra seats in their class, Daryl. Anyways, it's entirely possible that you are an incredibly established person, whether it's Wi-Fi or cloud or something like that, and you were in the right place at the right time, got the right experience, and have as much or more knowledge than anybody else who's got that piece of paper. So I don't, it is what it is in that respect. That's a whole separate tangent, and we just had it. But so back to the idea of those who can do and those who can't teach. I dispute that because I know there are people in higher ed that went to college to become a professor. That's what they wanted to do. I had that conversation with some of my professors in college. I also know that there are some people and again, I went for teaching, so obviously if they went for teaching and they are teaching, they're doing what they wanted to do, so that doesn't really apply. But, looking at certain people, like if they were a law professor or, a marketing or an accounting or something like that, the reality is a lot of those professors are like adjuncts, and they're coming from that world. They're teaching because they want to make extra money. Sometimes they're not paid a lot, and I'll be honest, some of those jobs when you start out, they're not paid a lot. So somebody who knows how to do it can do it, and they're going to do, they're going to get paid as an adjunct, make a little bit extra money, get a little bit of experience, help pay for like that advanced degree, and then move on with their career. So I don't begrudge anybody for teaching. And I don't know, I couldn't tell you why it popped in my head. I was driving around the island and it popped in my head, and I figured, let's talk about it. So here we are talking about it. And so the reason for it is, I'm like, well, does me teaching RCWA mean I can't hack it? And I think on the other hand, it actually doesn't. I know it doesn't. I know what I'm doing most of the time, or at least I can convince you that I'm doing what I'm doing most of the time. But so, I think to me, for what it is, it's a lot harder to teach than people realize. And I don't think you realize it. I don't think you're going to admit it or accept it or understand it as truth until or unless you're up there teaching. And that could be anything. It doesn't have to be a class, doesn't have to be boot camp. It could be an hour presentation. Heck, at this point with WLPC rapidly approaching, it could be a 10-minute 10 talk, right? It takes a lot to get up on stage and talk about a technical topic. It's not the reason why I don't do a lot of technical stuff. It's not my comfort area, but it takes a lot. I mean, you look at, so I'm going to plug Roel and Francois' Clear Descent podcast, right? So you look at that podcast that they put together, and they put a lot of our other technical podcasts to shame. They do show notes. They actually do research. I mean, who knew? Research, right? I'm sitting here in a car staring at an iPad with a soundboard on it, and I'm just talking to you. And I'm grateful for the 10, 15, 20 people who are listening, and that's great, and I'm happy. But, this is not, I'm not researching. This is me shooting from the cuff, if you will, shooting from the hip. And, they research and they have some really hard hitting topics. I mean, they've gone through the different parts of various CWNP level certifications, packet analysis. And if I'm throwing out topics they didn't cover, I apologize if you go hunting and you can't find it. But that to me is a form of teaching, right? And it takes a lot. You have to have knowledge. You have to know where to go find it if you don't have the knowledge. And then more importantly, and this is, I think, is a trait, and I had this conversation with one of my daughter's instructors the other day, you could take a hard topic and teach it the way that you know, and 99% of the people could think it's really, really hard to understand. And, Wi-Fi is like that. And there are a lot of topics that are like that. And I kind of feel like it's maybe AP's one to pick on, right? Like, I'm sure if you talk analysis to Peter McKenzie, it's like super simple to him. Maybe it's not, and I don't want to be dismissive of it, but to me, it seems like it comes easy to him. And I know AP was a hard one for me. It took me more than a couple tries to get the certification, and I don't do packet analysis on a regular basis, something that I was painfully reminded of this week. But it's hard to teach it. But a good teacher makes a hard subject seem simple. And I say this because it happened with my daughter, and she's learning some math in high school, and it's a hard topic, and the instructor went through it, and she said, as soon as I broke it down into a really simple form, and it just clicked. And that is, to me, the mark of a good teacher. And so how do I bring it back, full circle, those who can do, those who can't teach? I can do Wi-Fi. I know if I were pressed into the field and go back to what I was doing before I became an SE, I would have no problem doing it. But I have some rust? Absolutely. Anything you've not done for a couple of years, you're going to have rust. And the reality is, I think everybody in our profession, in any profession in IT, who is going back to an office after months and years away with the pandemic, there's rust. I mean, you forget how to do things. You forget where certain things are. Whatever your excuse might be, it's different. It's a change. It's sort of a new reality. It's a new world. It's almost everything is old is new again, right? So it was, to me, this was a conversation starter. This is not an indictment of myself saying I can't do it or I can't do Wi-Fi, so I'm going to teach. And I would honestly, to be honest, teaching has been something that I've always, I chased it. I have a major in my degree in college is elementary education. You can talk to Chris. He and I have had this conversation before about what it would take to, and of course it was before the pandemic, in which teaching looked a whole lot different than it does now. And honestly, a little funny story that I think I've told some people, but I don't think I've ever told them on a podcast, because Spatial Streams hasn't recorded much since this happened. And so last year, around this time, actually it was probably early December, we'll call it, I got an email from Keith or from Matthew about teaching a boot camp at WLPC. And I was like, well, okay, I don't have my CWNT and all that. And I didn't know about it, but I'm flattered and I'd love to. But I started by, I'm like, you sure you have the right John? Because obviously John's a pretty common name. It's not like they're emailing like, some crazy unique name, and it was definitely clearly me. And so what happened actually, so Chris Avance has a guy that works for him named John Moen, and John Moen was the one who was intended to teach the CWNA. And I said I'd be happily, willing to do it, but knowing that you can't teach the CWNA unless you have a CWNT, and that requires having some actual courses under your belt, having taught them, it was not impossible, but until it was realized that it was a goof, it was something that, I had reached out to like Keith, and I think I had talked to oh gosh, I talked to the CWNP folks and just kind of figured out, like, what do I have to do to get this to happen, to see if I could make it happen. And the idea of teaching a boot camp at WLPC and all that went with it, that was, I would say, was a seed that was planted in December of last year because of a faux pas, really. And I think, and my goal, to be honest, when I pitched teaching the RCWA to my leadership, was I know that I need to get smarter and better with ruckus gear. I've been working on it for 2 years. I know it. I'm comfortable around it. It doesn't frighten me nearly like it did when I first started. It wasn't frightening, but it's something new and I had never touched it. But now it's, let's take it to the next level. And how do you really master something? And I had this conversation with Keith Parsons at WLPC before I got my CWNE, actually. So going back to 2019, and I said, I want to get to the point where I can sit here, whether it's a podcast or in front of the audience in a class or at a 10 talk or whatever, and just talk freely and rattle off all the different amendments, and not all of them, obviously. There's a whole lot of amendments and rules and every bit and piece of the 802.11 spec and all that. But I want to get to the point where I can be like those people. And I named him Eddie Ferrero and a host of others that are so knowledgeable, and it seems to come so effortlessly. And he said, you have to remember, and this again, pre-pandemic, he said, a lot of those guys that you mentioned are out there teaching in front of people 30, 40 plus weeks a year, live, instructor-led, in-person classes where they're teaching this material. So while, yes, they are masters of it, it didn't come overnight. It was something that they worked hard for, and a lot of it is a byproduct of the fact that they've been teaching it. And so if you teach something constantly, you're going to, it's going to stick, right? It's going to be something that and you can comfortably talk about at a moment's notice. And so that's kind of, again, lots of different tangents and diatribes and all that. Not a diatribe. Diatribes are a bad thing. But so that's kind of what happened. That's where I went with it. And that's why the boot camp came to be. I mean, that was part of it, right? The other part of it was I wanted to get ruckus out there, and I really wanted to push it and, be a part of bringing ruckus back to, back to what we, want to be a part of, the wireless community. And so here I am, talking to you about the whole idea of teaching. And I think training is important. Two prongs, right? Getting training is important. You need to get smarter. Iron sharpens iron. It's always good to get training. And, so many people have said it. It's been talked about on stage at WLPCs. It's been talked on podcasts, etc. That, and I think Jim actually made a comment about it at Prague a couple of weeks back on his talk, that, the CWNE is kind of like a black belt, right? Like the black belt's not an end, it's the beginning of a journey. And I've heard that said more and more, and it makes sense, right? At the end of the day, that's a checkpoint in your career. It's not the end, right? You're not done and then you stop doing stuff. You're always learning. Wi-Fi is always changing, right? When I got my CWNE, Wi-Fi 6 was really new. 6E wasn't out yet. 7 wasn't out yet. We weren't even able to really talk about either one, and now they're both topics that we talk about. And so, that's sort of, you're always going to be evolving, you're always going to be learning, and if you're not, then, how useful are you, right? And something like Wi-Fi 7 is a perfect example, right? I'm looking at this. My boss, Jared, gave a Wi-Fi 7 talk in Prague. Little plug for Jared, but just going over the deck with him and reviewing it and hearing him give his practice talks and all that, the light bulb on my head went off, and I'm like, if I've never gotten a CWNA book since I took the CWNA the last time, I'm going to have to get one. Like, I'm going to get I'm going to have to get any books they've got to talk about it, anything that helps you learn it, because the reality is there's so much new in Wi-Fi 7. And, excuse me, and again, they haven't ratified it yet. It's not out. It's not official. But there's so much talked about. And even if half of it makes it to the standard and actually flies and gets deployed by vendors, sorry for that, there is a lot of new material. And it's, David Coleman said it, and he wants to take credit for it, but honestly, Jared and I and Daryl had a conversation before Prague and said basically the same thing. It's basically like you're learning Wi-Fi all over again. And maybe that's a little bit of an extreme. Maybe it's a bit hyperbolic, but it's true. I mean, at the end of the day, it's so radically different in so many ways, in some of the concepts. And some of them aren't new, but they're going to finally get deployed. You're going to have to learn. And maybe in your case, you're going to start being like me and say, you know what, maybe in order for me to learn, I need to start teaching, and you're going to start learning the material so you can teach it to somebody else, because you're committing it to memory and you're making sure you understand the concepts. And that's actually a good thing. I mean, that's part of the whole idea of mentoring in the community. That's the whole idea of, helping build the next generation, right? We're not all going to be here forever. I mean, I'm not that old, but I'm not that young. I'm basically middle-aged. And so I see some of the younger people coming in to the Wi-Fi community, and I look at them with envy, right? Because they're starting out in their 20s and they're going right to Wi-Fi, and it took me the most of my career, not all of it, but most of it, to get there. And I feel like I missed out on something. And I know, talking to some people around my age that have been here since the start, and I'm like, dude, I'm so, it would have been nice to have that experience, but it is what it is. But, we need to make sure that the next generation comes in and continues to take care of the airspace for everybody. And, learning and then teaching is a great way to do it. And, the other thing, fun fact, I mean, you look at guys like Keith and guys like Chris, and, you've got Fernay and Eddie and, Roel and Francois and Raymond Hendricks and, there's a couple others, but there's more than a couple others, and I'm just naming some of the ones off the top of my head. I think Scott McDermott, maybe, and if you don't, sorry. But these are guys that are out there who are teaching, or who taught or teach, CWNA, Ekahau, design courses, Wi-Fi fundamentals. And they've got, in most of them, they've got consulting gigs or something else on the side, or as a full-time job, and the teaching is a side thing. Some of them, obviously, before the pandemic especially, were really doing it full-time, and, some of them are still now. I know Chris is a full-time Wi-Fi trainer, Wi-Fi training. But, it's a vital and important part of the world, not just Wi-Fi, but anything, right? And so there's always something new to learn. There's always something new to teach. So it's a nice thing to do, and ultimately is a bit of a selfish thing. It's also a nice little side hustle to get into if you are good at it and can be an effective teacher. Because, I mean, you could know something, and I know plenty of people that know something. I know widgets really well, but I can't teach you widgets. And that's the rub, right? I mean, I know plenty of smart people, but they're horrible teachers. And they can't teach you something, or they don't want to. It's sort of a 50-50 split, right? I mean, you could be able to be a great teacher, but if you don't have the patience, or you don't have the desire, or in some places, some people are gatekeeping, they're not going to be good teachers. And you know what? It's not for everybody. And there are some people that love teaching, and maybe they're not that good at it. Maybe that's going to be me. I don't know. We'll find out in a couple months. I'd like to think I'll be decent at it. I hope I'll be decent at it. I'm hoping somebody will tell me if I'm not. And I'd like to have the opportunity to grow and learn and improve. But, I challenge the idea of those who can do and those who can't teach, because I know plenty of people, especially in this little wonderful Wi-Fi community, who can do it and do it. Yes, I just said do. But also do teach. And they do both fairly well. I've been taught by a few of the names I dropped, and I've seen the work of a few of the names that I dropped, and I know that they could do either one exclusively and do it well. And the fact that they do both at basically the same time and do both of them exceptionally well is, a testament to them, and proof that, the iron sharpening iron is true. And I think in some cases, because they're out there teaching and also doing, it makes them more relevant teachers, as well as better instructors, because they're continuing to maintain, a good connection to what's going on in the community, what's going on in different networks and environments. And, maybe they're not going through the stress of maintaining and, deploying and doing change controls and all that now, but they've all done it, and they all know what it's like, and they still hear the war stories talking to their customers and their client base. So, I think it's a different way to look at it. It is what that is. But, I'm excited for it. It's a very rambling podcast that I'm going to wrap up here very, very shortly, but I'm excited for the RCWA. I believe at this point it'll definitely be on the registration. If you've been listening to me and you're interested in Ruckus and you've got the ability to take it, I'd love to have you in February. If you're not interested in Ruckus, but you're going to be out for another boot camp, hey, come bend my ear and we'll talk. Clearly I can do that. But yeah, and for everybody who's a new listener, who's been listening for all, whatever I'm at, 5 or 6 episodes, make this 7, I think. Thank you. And, share it with a friend and say, hey, look, if you want to kill 20, 30 minutes with a rambling fool who talks about Wi-Fi wrestling and all sorts of different stuff, then by all means, point them in my direction. But with that, this one will be called for the night. And, have a great rest of your week. Good night, everybody.